Some have left us, but there are still a lot of people here. And I hope you've taken this seriously and had conversations with your neighbors about what's on top now, or perhaps where you still have specific questions. In the discussion that follows, we'd like to avoid anyone standing up and giving a lecture. We don't need to do that. But of course, it doesn't have to be just questions of understanding. It can also be questions you have for a deeper understanding that will then get another conversation going. As I said, we had actually planned these yellow slips of paper so that everyone would have the chance to write them down. Now we're doing it spontaneously and differently. Where are there specific questions or connections? Ava is not here. My Quran edition also has an index where you can read all the names of people that are mentioned. Certain women are mentioned, but only in this style, so to speak, chiaroscuro or unclarified, clarified. You only hint at it, but then you somehow know what is meant. Yes, it does happen, but the fall of man, in the sense that it is not in the Quran, so there is nothing in the Quran about original sin. Yes? I think we should have a very concrete understanding today of all possible variants of the Quran that are said to have existed in parallel. There are also the Gospels in Christianity and the Bible, some of which contradict each other. And you hear different Jesus stories, for example, in the book of Yucca. And then there's also Mark and John. And those who have not yet done so are not selective. More versions have survived. Of course, Osman had this intention, that's absolutely true. However, he did not succeed. Thus, there are certainly distinctions within Islamic scholarship which differentiate between various aspects. And there are also differences in the printed editions of the Quran. I'll just read you a very specific variant now, namely in Surah 80. Yes, it says there, where there is talk of the well-preserved book. So there is talk, so to speak, of the Quran being written in a preserved book, or in a preserved leaf, so to speak. Yes? And there it is, in Arabic it is a genitive, so to speak, yes, the genitive, that is, in a preserved book. Yes, it is indicated, so to speak, by a very specific vocalization. However, this vocalization is only, so to speak, only additional characters to the written consonants. Yes, so if you were to omit or change these symbols, yes, that's just a minor finger stroke, then the text would mean something different. It is stored in a book. The text is stored in a book, like a text is in a preserved book. Yes, do you understand? So this dogma alone, that the Quran is in the sky, that is then expanded, in a sky it is, so to speak, well preserved, yes, that can be very well refuted and say,
There is another reading that is also handed down within the Islamic tradition. For example, the Qurans in North Africa are slightly different from the Qurans in East Arabia. So there are quite a few variants, but you have to put some effort to find them out. Agreed? Or is that enough for you? I found it very interesting, however. I had somewhat different expectations about the introduction to the Quran. I thought it would be less about text, reconstructive theological studies, and more about what the actual theological message is, and the admonition to people not to deviate from church life or what belongs to it. But okay, I'll take that for now. That was just a third of the prayer. My question is, if we order the answer again, what is the relationship between the Quran and Hadith? A short answer for someone who is a novice in this field. Well, a Hadith. The hint probably doesn't get across the question, right? In other words, what is the difference between the Quran and so-called Hadiths? So the Quran is God's word, and a Hadith is the word of man. Namely, the word of the Prophet or words from the Prophet. But this is clearly distinguished in Islam. I mean, there is hardly a zone where this overlaps. I don't want to complicate this here, of course that exists, but that's such a minimal area that it doesn't matter for the overall judgment. It still has to be followed chronologically and in sequence. People also thought that this was just a piece of art. That's what we called ourselves. But the scholars have to conduct it in such a way that it is an incredible, big, huge, socially understandable book. And we know from Rabbi Abdul Samad that the book is a woodlouse, the book of love and the woodlouse. And all these verbs, all these phrases, including the departure, it's a temperance. Shorten them and beat them hands and fingers. What do you think about the sanctity in the old Christian tradition? So it's also it won't work now if 5 people speak at the same time. Here, would you please be quiet over there for the time being? The gentleman is still speaking. I'm supposed to speak. I'm supposed to speak to you. Yes. Please back up. A little more. Rathshu. Very good. Thank you very much. So, you're probably using the Goldman edition, aren't you? Yes, I mean, I ask you, who is actually Allah? Let's say to God Joe or God or... I mean, Allah means the one God or the God in Arabic. And you can translate that into German too, there's a word for it. And I mean, it's a fundamental error to always say, so the Jews have Yahweh as God, the Christians have God as God, and the Muslims have Allah as God. So that is such nonsense, such rubbish. That belongs out of the textbooks. So alone, what in the textbooks of nonsense on Islam is really incredible. Yes, I mean, what do you want to say about the Quran? Have you read the Quran? Yes, you can write to me and tell me what bothers you about it. You should jedenfalls read a decent edition of the Quran. So not this old stuff there by Ullmann from the 19th century. He has no idea about philology had. That must first Conan. You must first somehow with the Arabic text get done. I have the question a bit in another way understood. Perhaps it helps when I say the difference between the martial, violent passages, which we can also find in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the way it is received in the Quran, as I understand you, is that we create a distance from it with historical critical methods and say, if Elijah is proud of it, to kill the prophets of Baals, and who counts in the hundreds who are slaughtered there, that we say, well, this is in a certain historical context. That is also not historical literally, and we are not compelled to do it with similar brutality. And the reference to the fact that the Quran is, so to speak, divine and remains and is once and for all, that kind of gap does not take place, where one can say that these things, even if they are historically determined, are still valid. Did I understand you correctly that you say, okay, so long as we assume that all these things are in the Quran, such violent calls are actually still in effect, then we indeed have a problem with Muslims regarding engaging in conversation. So then it would be a question, what is theological, what are these holy texts different? Now today, however, I must say it was really about an introduction, because the question of historical criticism, all that will yet come, there should still be time for it, but you are now also in demand, also as a philologist, who initially made an effort to translate, one can't just read such passages, calls for violence, not even smooth them out philologically, which you did not do at all. Is it really just a question of interpretation? We do that with such violent sentences. Of course. I did not understand it. I believe you are simply wrong. I believe you are wrong. I believe you are incorrect. Yes, that cannot be done either. I mean, you have to first properly read the text, so to speak, and engage with it. And I mean, I do not deny that there are certain errors in the translations. I mean, the whole problem, which I have tried to explain to you, is that the issue of translating the Quran is a significant theological issue in Islam. And I mean, the question of how you approach the Quran, for that you first need certain philological tools, which you also need as New Testament scholars and Old Testament scholars, yes, and no one denies that. Only with Islam, it is of course a bit more difficult, precisely because it is not a religion where there is an authority recognized by all that could somehow decide, yes, it is read this way and it is read that way. That is indeed very problematic with Islam. There is simply no supreme teaching authority. I mean, there is, but in the Christian church it varies significantly. I mean, especially among Protestants, it varies greatly. I am well aware of that. But there are other ways, yes, to arrive at certain decisions. I do not want to blatantly insinuate that I have read the Quran and have not read it. He subsequently became a Catholic priest in Munster. That's not him. He even stands there as we are supposed to kill him. I told him that I was dragged into this because I said to myself, explain to me, who's outrageous in your room? Yes, there I am. I mean, you would have to get involved in more precise textual criticism, so to speak, but that wasn't my job either. It was an introduction to the Quran in general, and I believe I did that. And I don't deny in any way that, of course, there are things in the Quran that we don't like, that I don't like either. But you can believe me that I have studied the Quran very intensively. Here there is still a message, and then in the back there's obviously more. The one with the sea. What he says to Saria, and then maybe we can still the other question. And these are the two of them. Yes, so to start with the question, there are no 10 commandments as a collection of 10. You have to piece them together, so to speak, but you can already determine the content of the 10 commandments in the Quran. So that's about that question. The other question was about Sharia. Sharia is, so to speak, the system of Islamic law. Yes, and there are very different things that are part of Sharia. First, or in general, it is said that Sharia consists of the Quran as the divine word. Secondly, it stems from the tradition of the prophets. Thirdly, from what's called the analogy conclusion. And then fourthly, from what's called the consensus of the community. Yes, these are very different things. That means that what the consensus of the community is, that's stretched very thin, so to speak. I mean, when the question arises about what is actually the community, yes, I mean, when Mr. Erdogan, for example, says this or that, which he's doing now extensively, yes, he refers to this consensus in part. Yes, but I think the Arab world has a completely different consensus than, for example, Indonesia. Yes, or and so on. I mean, Islam is a world religion where the question is, what exactly is the Islamic community? And who has the right to speak on behalf of the Islamic community? It's just a problem that has not been clarified to this day. What does apology mean? This applies to Christianity as well. I mean, what is Christianity? That's nonsense, what you're saying. So by all means, very good, yes, then I have to go mine. That's good, yes, then we'll move on. Yes, very good. Your boy who is from the country, from the point of view of the intervention, yes, but that is why it was not addressed. And this is definitely not such a sensible process, but firstly, it will probably come up in your lecture series, and secondly, it does not make sense to blame the organizers or the speakers in this way. Seriously, but we have forgotten something. I think I find it very interesting in the manner that this first surah that you have quoted, the first surah, is formulated, that they say, on the one hand, it is the book of Allah, divine God, but that excludes us. Or does the work imply that people talk about their everyday lives first and foremost? Secondly, they also conduct consultations on theological questions. We come together for consultations. And for me, this is an ijma, an agreement, perhaps even reaching a consensus or addressed from certain personal opinions. Mostly even in practical questions, but also in theological questions. And for me, it's important that there is a culture of counseling service in the Quran. Now I'll switch to Stefan Wagner, the Islamic artist. Perhaps this is an important point to put into perspective what he has to say. The Islamic artist, the Islamic guilt, the Islamic guilt, the Islamic guilt in all extreme, moderate things, something like a season of Zorate. Here it seems to be the relation of law, of service. Some disputes are intriguing, I also think. To see the term acceptance has seen the disputes as intriguing. So, the people in the back couldn't understand you at all. Could you please go back to the microphone to make yourself heard? This is an interesting matter, but we didn't understand anything. It's challenging. Had it been in the Albert Schweitzer Hall, I might have understood it a bit better. The Quran has a culture of consulting each other. In short, it's not only a culture of telling where to go, but also a culture of searching together. And I think that's interesting, as you said earlier, during Muhammad's time, the confrontation with the Arab tribal religions and with very different kinds of Christians. The Christians were not one but very different, the Jews and the Ethiopians and everything else you've mentioned. One could see the Quran as a contribution of mutually correcting each other and consulting each other and saying to Christians and Jews, or especially to Christians, if you actually claim that God had such a son, that cannot be, because that cannot happen in the concept of God. If God is almighty, then of course he can still have such a son. Essentially, a scriptural text is the result of grappling with different positions and entails a much greater diversity than it often seems when one simply says, but it says in there, you must do this and that. Yes, okay, then back there. So, the question was about the mystics in Islam. Mysticism in Islam has certainly been a very large and influential movement. And it still is. I mean, it's by no means just a thing of the past. Mysticism still exists, meaning it's a very personal form of Islam, focusing on the individual, where one believes, which Islamic mysticism, of course, shares with other forms of mysticism, that one essentially finds God within oneself. Yes, I can recommend a few books by Anne-Marie Schimmel to you. She has extensively studied the subject in German and in English. Yes, check that. Okay, there's still something back there, and then we'll gradually get to it. Well, that's not written in the Quran. I can't tell you that here, so to speak. Well, the Quran, the problem is that it's a mixed text, so to speak, which has the most diverse literary styles. Yes, for the Bible too. I mean, you can start from certain narrative chapters like Joseph's chapter 12 or chapter 18, also contains various narratives. Yes, that, for example, the ancient Alexander novel plays a big role, which the Quran incorporates with certain motifs, such as what's told about Elijah and so on. So it's really a compendium, as it were, of late antique literature. Everything is incorporated into the Quran. Yes, and of course the biblical tradition too, yes, but only in a special form, so to speak. Not Muhammad himself, of course. I mean, the question now whether he could read and write, yes, that is, I didn't think of it now, but this, many Muslims claim that Muhammad was illiterate. I mean, that's like the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, yes. I mean, Muhammad was supposed to have been a merchant and could not read and write. You can't imagine, no. So if you've also dealt with the ancient world, so to speak, you need certain basic knowledge for this, of course. That's quite clear, yes. And the Arabic script is not so bad that you can't work with it. I didn't want to do it now, but then you have the last question, and then yes, I mean, you have now mentioned Sunnis and Shiites. I mean, that will certainly be explained in another lecture in the series. Of course, there are enormous differences, mainly based on the question of who was, in a manner of speaking, the legitimate successor of the Prophet Muhammad, yes. But as far as the Quran is concerned, it is such that there is actually a broad consensus today that the Quran is accepted, so to speak. So the Quran text as it is, but with certain variants and so on, that it is practically accepted by all Sunnis and Shiites and also the third group. So that is, as far as that is concerned, there is also a certain progress to be seen. Whether a text applies equally to everyone, that's a question we also have with the Bible. And you said there are very different genres, very different times, completely different types of words have been spoken into them. And that's why we experience it in our church. When people say, with the Bible in their hands, that's what it's written in the Bible. It is important to say, is this a poetic text, a vision, is this a law? What is actually behind it?
We just won't be able to take a closer look at context tonight. You mentioned Hamid Abdel Samad earlier, that is our speaker 2 from now, who will certainly also cover very critical passages in great detail. We have designed this whole lecture series so that we don't want to bypass any topics, but an introduction to what really makes up the Quran also includes an introduction to what really makes up the Quran, and not passages that have maybe dominated the discussion for several decades, but do not occupy such a big space in the devotion of 90% or 95% of Muslims. But we'll see what it's like in the next few evenings. Thank you for being here. Above all, I would like to thank you very much. As I said, since the event was quite expensive for us, feel free to donate. But you are also welcome to leave money to buy books by Hartmut Bobzin at the book table, and make sure to take the flyer where the next dates and events are listed, or our parish newsletter. Get home safely. See you at the beginning of April.